For 200 years, the asylum was the dominant institution for treating mental illness. And when they were established at the end of the 18th century, they were established on the basis of the psychological language of moral therapy, the idea that when mental illness occurred, it was as a result of a disturbance in judgment or reason, rather than something that was happening in the body. The treatment, therefore, was predicated on the idea that reason or judgment could be targeted through methods of persuasion, kindness, acts of humanity, and the reordering of life in an organized, calm, therapeutic setting. How we came to this point will be the subject of this module. Do you have a soul? Is it something that you think about? And if you do have a soul, what exactly is it? Is it our sense of ourself, our inner being, our core being? Is it something that is a result of our biological organization? Or has it been put there by a creator? Is it immortal? This is probably not a question that you think about terribly much. The more religious among you will have thought long and hard about the nature of your immortal soul. However, it is an issue that is absolutely central when we try and explore explanations for madness in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So what we're going to start off doing here is to undertake a brief history of the soul before moving along to see how it fitted in with the various theories of disease that were current during this period. William Blake's engraving, the soul leaving the body, reluctantly parting with life. I think we see in this image a very traditional view of the soul, the Christian view of the soul. And for much of Christian history, this was the predominant view. The soul was something that inhabited the body, controlled the body up to a point, was possessed with reason, and was immortal. This situation created significant problems for understanding madness. It was clear a soul could become corrupted by evil, making poor judgments and being led into temptation. But the soul itself couldn't go mad because of its eternal nature. Imagine this scenario: the madman dying, raving, crazy, violent. If his soul went mad and remained mad unto death, how could he be judged? How could he be held responsible for his actions? And what sort of a God would have anyway allowed the soul to be touched by madness? Certainly not a benign one. Now, the period we are about to examine saw a dramatic change in how bodies and souls were imagined, and in turn how madness and its treatment was configured and reconfigured. We start during a period where madness was either perceived as an imbalance of the humours, the result of poor treatment of the body, or as a product of supernatural intervention, as we saw in the last module. We see as well that as society transforms, religion weakens, science becomes a dominant way of exploring the world. In other words, the whole process of the Enlightenment, a transformation occurs in ideas about the body and the mind and the soul. The place of the soul then becomes relegated. Focus is laid upon the senses and their connections with the mind and consciousness, opening up the way for the moral therapy that we see in the asylums in the 19th century. Behind all of this, it's important to remember that the body, the soul, and the mind all have a history. The soul itself is conceived differently in different periods. The Christian soul as we know it now is very much an invention of the Middle Ages, a buttress of Orthodox Christianity, guarding the authority of popes and kings. The soul, as well, is central to eschatology. In other words, theories about the end of days, the apocalypse, and to the maintenance of order and social stability, which is then integrated to notions of heaven and hell, heavenly reward, purgatory and punishment. Bodies were secondary to all of this, temporal, decaying, a mark of weakness, a mark of humanity, a mark of the fall. Although, of course, it was believed that the soul would be reunited with the body at the last judgment. But it was crucial for the soul to be purged from the medical view of madness. And purged it was under the rigour of the empiricist thinkers of the Enlightenment. And this is the process that we will now examine. So first of all, I want to set up Descartes with his Cartesian dualist thinking as a benchmark. And I'm going to put forward the idea there is a before and after Descartes in relation to madness and the soul. So as I've just indicated, the sense of self, our soul, is bound to God and the order of the world at this time. William Blake's Ghost of a Flea, like much of Blake's work, is somewhat heretical in terms of orthodox religion. Most people in the post-Descartes era would not believe that animals possess souls. Blake, on the other hand, had a weird pantheistic view of the universe that could see the soul in everything. Nevertheless, Blake bound the soul to God and the order of the world. The soul, as well, is pre-existing. It is the substance of humanity, and it is the seat of reason. Now, as we've seen, the body can be possessed by the devil or through witchcraft, but the soul remains untouched. If the individual so possessed is exorcised and the demons leave them, they once again become a rational individual. And of course, the soul as well can be perverted by an alliance with the devil, the Faustian pact. But this is a decision freely made by reason and therefore freely made by the soul. And the soul can be held accountable for making this kind of bargain. But as we've seen already, most madness is a bodily affliction far removed from the supernatural. Now, this is the problem of madness and the soul. In Aristotelianism, orthodox scholastic theology continues to insist that the soul is immortal and inviolate right the way through the Middle Ages. This, of course, had been questioned by Lucretius in the 1st century BC. He believed that body and the mind were made of the same material. If not cured, the soul is violated and possibly destroyed. It is corrupted by madness. And for him, madness demonstrated that the soul was just as mortal as the body, and upon death, upon expiration, the soul would be destroyed. This is a materialist position that challenges the orthodox thinking of the scholastic tradition, and it is also heretical, and yet it is something that is played around with and tested. It is the doctrine against which the problem of madness and the soul has to be solved. Now, the best way of defending the immortal soul can be seen from the 17th century conceptions described in Akihito Suzuki's article. The essence of the soul remains intact during the most violent fit of madness, and the disorder takes place only in the body. Here we see David, and within David there is a brain, and within the brain we can see two forms of functions. Higher functions of judgment and reason, this is the location of the soul, and lower functions that relate to memory, imagination, and fantasy. And obviously there's a connection between the two, and obviously one influences the other. The hope is that reason can exercise control over fantasy. Now, the early modern view was this, if we build in humorism. Maybe we see an attack of the black bile, melancholia ensues, and in the process breaks the link between the lower functions and the higher functions. So what is affected in an attack like this are memory, imagination and fantasy. Judgment and reason are still there, but they're cut off from the rest of the body. The soul is left inviolable and intact. Now, Descartes was incredibly important in a number of areas, both scientific and philosophical. He was a deeply influential thinker whose ideas spread across Europe. He was also best known for developing a theory that demonstrated that we could have certain knowledge of at least ourselves and therefore absolute knowledge to some degree of the world. But this is not the issue that we're interested in here. All we are interested in here is the division between the mechanical body and the animated soul. For what Descartes did was he reimagined the body as if it was some form of automaton. It could be explained in terms of mechanics. And here we can see the kind of diagrams that illustrate the similarities between man and machine. But a human being was more than a machine. A human being contained the mind, the soul, in fact. And it was the soul that animated the body and controlled the body. So within this perception, we can see a different form of madness. Remember, before, the break occurred between the higher and lower functions in the brain. In dualist perception, the break is going to occur somewhere else. Now, our thing in the world is observed through sensory inputs, through the body machine. In this instance, the eye. The eye picks up light from the giraffe and it processes the light and it sends the image to the brain and tells it that it is a giraffe. When the body machine is functioning well, the mind, the soul, functions equally as well. What, however, if the body machine goes wrong? Again, the image comes into the eye, it goes all squirrely, and the next thing you know, we're in the realms of delusion. The thought thing is the wrong thing. Now, the breakage has not gone on at the lower regions of the mind, in the areas of fantasy and imagination. Rather, it has gone on at the level of sensory input into the body. And for many people, this remained the dominant perception of how madness occurred during this period. And of course, the body machine could go wrong through humoral imbalance or later on through problems with the nerves. But they're all problems of the senses. And of course, if the body machine goes wrong, then the best way to try and put things right is to put the body machine right. And if you can put the body machine right, then you can go some way to actually setting the mind to rights. So to summarise, in this model, madness is the failure to process thought properly. It is a break between observed things and thought things. It occurs in the body machine, but it leaves the soul, which Descartes believed was lodged within the pineal gland, intact. And it is the position that is supported by some of the greatest physicians of the day, including Hermann Boerhaave, who we will return to towards the end of this lecture. But the ideas expressed so fully by Descartes were soon to break down under the ferocious gaze of Locke's empiricism. John Locke is one of the most famous and celebrated of British Enlightenment philosophers, known for his key work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. If I were to identify a key Lockean point, it would be the idea that at birth the mind was a blank slate, the tabula rasa, and education and culture and society were inscribed upon the mind and forged the individual into a certain kind of character. Now, Locke himself didn't deny that there was a soul, but he put it in the background. It's almost as if it's something that emerges through the process of socialization and culturation. We can see that this is a fundamentally different way of understanding the body, particularly when we look at the weight that Locke placed upon the senses. We could only know things through our senses. We could only process them in our brain through our senses. Everything was sense experience and sense impressions. Critical to understanding how the Lockean perspective changed the language and theory of psychology, it is important that we look at the Molyneux problem, which was a very, very interesting thought experiment. William Molyneux was himself a philosopher and scientist, and he communicated quite regularly with Locke. He sent a letter to Locke in the late 1680s, and in this letter he posed the following problem. A man being born blind and having a globe and a cube, nigh of the same bigness, committed into his hands and being taught or told which is called the globe and which the cube, so as easily to distinguish them by his touch or feeling, then both being taken from him and laid on a table, let us suppose his sight restored to him. Whether he could by his sight, and before he touched them, know which is the globe and which the cube, or whether he could know by his sight, before he stretched out his hand, whether he could not reach them, though they were removed 200 or 1,000 feet from him. So basically translated, what this means is, if you're born blind, you can learn to feel and identify the shape of a cube or a globe, a sphere. However, if your sight is restored to you, and you weren't able to touch those objects, would you be able to recognize them as the globe or sphere? Now, Locke, when Molyneux originally sent the problem to him, ignored it, but Molyneux prompted him again a couple of times, and then Locke thought about it and thought, this is deeply, deeply interesting, because it gives us a way of trying to judge the relative weights of the senses. That's how impressions are received into the body, and what we do with those senses with our judgment or our reason. And Locke thought about this for a long time, and I don't know what your answer would be, have a think about it, but Locke thought about it for a long time and decided that the answer was no. It basically meant that your senses could be functioning fine, but your judgment was wrong. It was a great thought experiment, and the idea spread across Europe, particularly to France, where a group of materialist thinkers were trying to reconfigure our sense of the world and locate it in natural laws of explanation. Lockean empiricism was deeply attractive to these individuals like Voltaire. Now, it just so happened that the thought experiment that Molyneux put forward became real. William Cheselden, one of the great surgeons and anatomists of the early 18th century, believed that he could cure through surgery cataracts, and he carried out the first operation on a 13-year-old boy during the 1720s. This is how he described the boy's perception once he could see again after the operation. When he first saw, he was so far from making any judgment of distances that he thought all objects, whatever touched his eyes, as he expressed it, as what he felt did his skin, and thought no object so agreeable as those which were smooth and regular, though he could form no judgment of their shape, or guess what it was in any object that was pleasing to him. So he was almost feeling a sense of touch in his eyes, and the objects that were being placed in front of him, he couldn't recognise them. Cheselden continues, he knew not the shape of anything, nor any one thing from another, however different in shape or magnitude, but upon being told what things were, whose form he knew before from feeling, he would carefully observe that he might know them again. In other words, the patient of Cheselden's sensations were functioning perfectly well, but because there was not a proper association going on between perception and the senses, he was unable to name the things that he could see. But this didn't mean that his judgment was wrong. On the contrary, as soon as he was told what an object was, he could relearn the association and everything would be sorted out. On the face of it, it appeared that Cheselden had been able to solve the Molyneux problem. And there were certainly many individuals on the continent, in France and the Low Countries, like Voltaire, Quimper and Condillac, great materialist radicals who really felt that the thought experiment had become real and that we could answer the Molyneux problem with a high degree of certainty. Now, there were others that were more sceptical, and it's interesting the shape that their scepticism took. The individuals who were particularly associated with criticisms of Cheselden's experiment were Lemaitre and Diderot, both of them materialist radical thinkers. And they believed, for example, that the experimental design was not particularly good, that the results were ambiguous, that the boy might have been able to see more than Cheselden let on. After all, cataracts are not complete blindness. However, what they were looking for was a better experimental design so the Molyneux problem could be tested better. What they wanted was a categorical no answer. The extent to which the Molyneux problem and developed a new psychological language that would feed into moral therapy can be seen in this imagined conversation between Boerhaave and the madman. This was Voltaire who set up this dialogue between Boerhaave, who we've already seen was a follower of the Cartesian school of thinking about madness, the soul, and the sensations. He had Boerhaave say, "Your soul is as spiritual, as pure, as immortal as ours, but our souls are well housed and yours badly. The window of the house are blocked up. It lacks air. It suffocates." To which the madman replied, "My windows are as open as yours, since I see the same objects and hear the same words. It must therefore follow that my soul makes bad use of my senses, or that my soul is itself only a vitiated sense, a depraved quality." Now don't be deceived by the word soul here. What Voltaire means by soul is judgment and reason. He does not believe in the immortal soul. He's just using it as shorthand. So the implication of the Molyneux problem and the way that it feeds into what will become moral therapy at the end of the 18th century are these. The inability to judge correctly does not necessarily mean that the sensations are wrong. It is a matter of false association. It is a problem that occurs in the mind and not the body, and doesn't even have to involve insanity, as in the case of Cheselden's patient. It opens the door to delusion as a major category of madness, almost like false association, run crazy. And it shifts away the perspective of people working in the nascent mind sciences from thinking about madness as a problem of the body and recognizing it as a problem of the mind.
Yeah, it's Illmatic. Yeah.
Now, there is an interesting coda to this story that is worth thinking about at this point, particularly in terms of the causes of madness and the way that madness is treated during the 18th century. What I want to do here, and I'm following in Suzuki's footsteps, is to compare the attitudes of the superintendents of two of London's prominent institutions. On the one hand, St. Luke's, on the other hand, Bedlam. The medical superintendent at St. Luke's was the wonderfully named William Batty. The institution was founded in 1751, and it was founded on the basis of the humanitarian treatment of the insane. In other words, the forms of treatment that were carried out there were not coercive. They look towards treating the patient kindly, reasoning with them, not employing methods of shock or force to restore the patient to reason. Batty held to that much older view that madness was the product of deluded imagination through delusive sensation. So he was coming out of the Boerhaave, Descartes tradition, and yet the treatment that was carried out at St. Luke's was altogether kinder than that we associate with Bedlam. Of course, Bedlam is imagined as the archetypal hammer house of horror asylum, the place where people would pay sixpence at the weekend to go and view the madmen and the mad women, the place where restraint was the order of the day, where the insane were treated as wild animals. But it just so happened that John Munro, the medical superintendent there, held to this newer psychological language. That what was going on was that there was seeing right but judging wrong, or vitiated judgment. Unfortunately, this did not seem to feed through into the treatment of the patients at Bedlam. At the moment, we are in this transitional period, and it is that transition that I want to examine through a very famous case study in the next module.